Welcome to this lesson revising transactional writing. Transactional writing is writing where the texts have been written for impact, and the intention is to make the audiences of those texts do something in response to the text. This is a revision video lesson, so it isn't going to teach you anything you shouldn't already know, and it isn't going to show you examples of transactional writing. It's going over the requirements and the expectations of the transactional writing tasks on paper 2 of the Edexcel exams. Okay, let's begin with a very broad overview of the transactional writing. So we'll start by looking at paper 2. The transactional writing appears in section B of paper 2 of the new 9:1 Edexcel GCSE English Language exams. You have a total of 45 minutes to produce your transactional writing response. There will always be a choice of 2 tasks. You must only do one of them in the 45 minutes available because you're being asked to provide an extended demonstration of your writing skills. There is a total of 40 marks available for the transactional writing piece that you produce. That is awarded over 2 separate mark schemes, one of which is for the content and the style of your writing, and the other is for the technical aspects, so the spelling, punctuation, grammar and vocabulary, just as it is for the imaginative writing tasks on paper 1. So what is transactional writing then? Well, transactional writing is essentially non-fiction. When you do the transactional writing task, you will always be asked to produce one piece of non-fiction. So you're not going to be asked to produce a story, a monologue or a description. That's what you're asked to do on paper 1 for the imaginative writing. Here with transactional writing it will always be non-fiction, the kinds of things that you've been dealing with in section A. Transactional writing is writing that is designed to prompt action from readers. So the types of text that you're asked to produce and the purposes you're asked to write for are designed to do things like make readers change their opinion about a subject, to maybe take some action based on advice given, to go out and vote for a political candidate, or maybe just to provide them with a deeper understanding of a topic. But they have a function. They're more than just entertaining. They're designed to make the reader actively engage and actively do something with the information that's presented to them. Transactional writing tends to be formal. It always uses mainly standard English, and in the mark scheme it specifies that you must be using standard English throughout your transactional writing. There are particular types of transactional writing forms where you may include some non-standard features, so some colloquialisms, but as a general rule it should be written in standard English, continuous sort of prose, organised into paragraphs, maybe chunked if that's appropriate for the sort of writing that you're doing. There are lots of different forms that you could potentially be asked to write in, so we'll go over those later in the lesson, and each potential form has its own set of structural conventions, and it is expected that you will apply those, that the examiner will be able to see those in the writing that you produce if you've been asked to write for a particular form. The key thing with transactional writing, which makes it different from something like imaginative writing, is that it is always aimed at a particular audience. Whilst that audience might be quite broad, it will tend to be an interest group or maybe a specific age group. So you might be asked to write an article, a magazine article for people that are interested in exotic cuisine, or you might be asked to write a web page to inform parents how to look after very young children. So it's quite broad, but it is a shared interest, or there is something that links the audience for the transactional writing. And transactional writing has a very specific purpose. There are 5 purposes to transactional writing, which we'll revise a little bit later, and each one of those purposes has its own set of conventions for language and in some cases for structure as well, and the expectation is that you will use those conventions when you're producing your response. Okay, so about the tasks then. The theme of the tasks will always be linked to the theme of the non-fiction text in section A. If you remember, the 2 non-fiction texts are always linked by a common theme, and the transactional writing task will pick up on those themes, and you will be asked to write for either the same theme or a similar theme. Both of the tasks will always ask you to produce some type of non-fiction text, so it's not the case that one of them will be creative writing and one of them will be non-fiction. They are both non-fiction. The SPAF, the subject, the purpose, the audience and form, will be clear from the wording of the task. Sometimes all four of those elements will be specified directly, but sometimes you just have to do a little bit of interpretation of the wording of the question to identify them, but you will be given clues in there even if it's not specified directly, and you should begin by identifying the SPAF. It is possible that both of the tasks could ask you to produce the same form of text. If they do, the audience or the purpose or the subject matter will be different. So at first glance it may appear that both tasks are asking you to do the same thing, but when you identify each aspect of SPAF you'll find that there are subtle differences, and as such the mark schemes will be different because they'll be looking for the conventions of the particular purposes, the audience, the subject matter, whatever it might be, that is different in each of those. Right, what are you expected to do then? Well, you are expected to provide what is called a consciously crafted extended piece of transactional writing. That means that you've thought about the content, you've thought about the devices, you've identified the SPAF, and you've made deliberate choices, deliberate informed choices of language features, structural features, content, vocabulary, tone, register, based on the SPAF of the particular task you're responding to. That's why you need to begin by identifying the SPAF, because it is those elements of SPAF that inform those deliberate choices of content, language, structure, vocabulary, or all the things that are going to be marked in the end. You must use the correct language and structural conventions for the form and purpose that you've been asked to write for, to make sure that your text prompts the action that is required from the reader. If you don't use the right language and structural conventions, your text will not have the right impact, it will not be effective. You also need to be accurate in your spelling and your use of grammar and punctuation. And with the grammar and punctuation, not only do you need to be accurate, but you also need to be using it for deliberate effect, to create effect. So there should be more than just a few full stops in there, and you should be using different grammatical structures to try and get a response from your reader. Okay, let's go on and have a look at the purposes of transactional writing. Now there are 5 purposes: argue, persuade, advise, inform and explain. And each one of these 5 purposes has its own particular set of conventions. Generally, with the transactional writing tasks, one of these 5 conventions will be the main purpose, and then you'll have one or more of them as sort of secondary purposes, and the expectation is you'll include conventions from all of the purposes that you're being asked to write about. Okay, let's start with writing to argue then, the conventions of writing to argue. Now, one of the key sets of conventions that writing to argue uses is rhetorical devices. So you can see a whole lot of different rhetorical devices there, and you're not expected to include all of these. What you're expected to do is to pick and choose, to use some discrimination and choose the devices, the rhetorical devices that work best for the form that you're asked to write and the audience that you are asked to write for. So for example, things like bullet point lists in the other lists section would not work if you are asked to write a speech. So you shouldn't be including bullet point or numbered lists when you're asked to write a speech or a talk. However, you can include groups of 3, because as a rhetorical device, when we hear information in groups of 3, we tend to remember it. So it's about understanding how your audience are going to receive your text and which of these devices is going to help you to get your message across most effectively and create the most powerful impact on your audience. When you're writing to argue, it's very important that you provide some counter-argument. And that simply means including some opinions or points from the opposite point of view to the one that you are arguing the case for. That's to show that you've considered the objections of the audience, you understood those, you've taken those into account, and your opinion is based on a kind of a judgment that's been formed by weighing up the pros and cons. So make sure you include some counter-argument. You also need to include some supporting evidence if you're writing to argue. Now this can come in the form of statistics, facts, even false facts, and you can get those from the non-fiction texts, or you can just make them up. Similarly, anecdotal evidence. This is using your own or somebody else's experience of the subject you're writing about to illustrate or to prove your point. And again, you can use something that's real, or you can just make it up because it's a convention. Also, expert opinion. That means, you know, maybe making up the name of a scientist or somebody an expert in the field that you're writing about to add credibility to your argument. That again is a very important part of writing to argue. And then you also need to help your reader through, so you need to signpost them through your use of connectives. So you're going to use additional connectives that add information furthermore, moreover, and then connectives for comparison and contrast to show that you are weighing up both sides of the argument. So there's some key conventions of writing to argue. In terms of writing to persuade, this is actually very similar to writing to argue, with one or two subtle differences and sort of a shift in the focus, because we're persuading rather than arguing. So again, rhetorical devices are a really important part of writing to persuade. And again, just with writing to argue and all the other purposes, the expectation is you will use some discrimination in your choice of those and only use the ones that are appropriate to your audience and the form. With writing that's aimed to persuade, your choice of pronouns is important. Try to use collective pronouns we and our, because it shows that you're identifying, you're sharing with the audience. You're inviting them in. And also then use, perhaps towards the end, some second person pronouns, you and your, because that suggests responsibility, and those kinds of pronouns are the things that prompt the audience into action, that makes them feel that they need to take action based on what you've written. Sentence structures and forms are important in writing to persuade. We tend to see lots of simple statements in writing to persuade. That doesn't mean that every sentence you write should be a simple sentence and should be expressed in the form of a statement. The examiners do want to see variety, and they do want to see simple, compound and complex. Within writing to persuade, imperative sentence forms are important. So forms that give sentences that give a command, and also rhetorical question forms, and that goes back to those rhetorical devices because it's a way to make your readers engaged, to think deeply about what you're writing. And just as with writing to argue, in writing to persuade you need to include some evidence, so statistics, facts, false facts, anecdotal evidence. This is because you are trying to get your audience to share your view and to do what you are asking them to do in response to something that they might not have any knowledge of, or they might not feel able to participate in. So you need evidence to back it up and to add authority to your writing. Right, conventions of writing to advise. Tone and register is key with writing to advise. You need to look at the subject that you are providing advice on and the audience that you are writing for. Your tone and register could be challenging, so you could be not aggressive, but you could challenge your audience, or alternatively you might need to adopt a reassuring tone dependent on the subject matter and the audience. When you're writing to advise, it is acceptable to include some non-standard English, some colloquialisms, but not to write in an overly chatty, informal style all the way through. Okay, you should still be writing primarily in standard English, but it is an accepted convention of writing to advise that there will be some colloquialisms in there to relate to the audience. And that's particularly the case if you're asked to write for a teenage audience or a young audience. In terms of what writing to advise does, it could be providing a warning. It will generally always offer some kind of solution to the problem that they're advising on in the form of practical advice about how you can deal with that problem. Again, going back to this idea of tone and register, you could include some humour. That's a common feature that we see in advice texts. Even when it's quite a serious subject, people that write advice texts tend to try and lighten the mood a bit, to inject some humour so that they don't frighten or alarm the audience. But because you're writing to advise, you will be using direct address because you are talking directly to your audience. As with writing to persuade, the choice of pronouns is important. With writing to advise, it's a good idea to stick with second person pronoun, because what you're trying to do in terms of the action you're trying to prompt, you're trying to get your readers to act on the advice, to do something, to change their behaviour or to behave in a particular way. So using these second person pronouns, you, your and yours, implies responsibility on the part of the reader. It kind of empowers them and suggests to them that they are the ones that have the ability to change the situation. Again, sentence structures and forms are really important. There will be some imperative forms in there, but there will also be lots of modal verbs. So remember your 9 modal verbs. They're an important feature in writing to advise. There might be rhetorical questions. In terms of the types of sentences, they do tend to be active to encourage action on the part of the reader, and they do include the whole range, so simple, compound and complex sentences for variety to make it interesting to read. They might also include what are called conditional sentences, which are basically complex sentences that indicate clearly how one course of action will lead to a particular outcome or consequence, and a conditional sentence will include the connective if. Structural conventions, things like 3-part lists, bullet numbered lists, and also always ending with a call to action. When you're advising, you are asking them to go out and do the thing that you've asked them to do. Okay, we'll turn now to the 4th of the 5 purposes of transactional writing, which is writing to inform. In terms of the conventions of writing to inform, structural devices are very important in writing to inform. So we would expect to see things like headings, maybe in the form of a headline if you're writing an article, subheadings to break up and chunk the information, bullet point lists would be appropriate in there, as would the chunking of information, so the grouping of information may be under subheadings. You would expect in something that's written to inform that there would be a linear, or what we call chronological, presentation of the information, so it makes sense, it flows, one point flows on from another. Also the use of temporal and sequential connectives would be in there to signpost the reader through the text so they can work their way through it easily. In terms of the language features, writing to inform is factual and formal. So you would have standard English used throughout, and it's highly likely that you would need to include some subject-specific vocabulary. Again, you can get this from the non-fiction text, or perhaps even from your own knowledge of the subject. So if you are asked to write on something very technical, it will be related to the subject matter of the non-fiction text, so that is your source of subject-specific vocabulary. As with writing to argue and writing to persuade, there's an expectation that you would include statistics and facts. Again, use the non-fiction text for a source for these, or maybe make them up. But remember, keep them believable. So unlike in writing to persuade or writing to argue, where you can be a bit extravagant, in writing to inform they need to be believable. You can include figurative devices in some types of writing to inform, generally only reviews, but don't overdo it. Alright, and remember your temporal and sequential connectives so that you signpost your reader through the text that you are producing. Okay, so now we come to the final purpose for writing to transactional writing, which is writing to explain. This is very similar to writing to inform, and as I said earlier, often one purpose is dominant and then you get a secondary purpose, and quite often inform and explain go together because they are so similar. So writing to explain is designed to provide instruction or clarification. It's things like textbooks, maybe an article or a web page that help people to gain a clearer, better understanding of a topic. Structural devices are important just as they are in writing to inform, so things that help to break the text up and to guide the reader through, such as headings, headlines, subheadings, bullet point lists of key points. In writing to explain, you tend to find mainly simple and compound sentences, but remember the examiners do want to see some complex sentences as well. Paragraphs within texts that are written primarily to explain will tend to open with a general statement that is then followed by a more detailed explanation. So the topic sentences are very clear in writing to explain. As with writing to inform, the overall organisation and structure of a piece written to explain will be linear, so chronological, and sequential and causal connectives, so cause and effect, are used to signpost the reader through the text and help them understand the topic. Language devices, again, very similar to writing to inform. Like writing to inform, it is in essence factual and formal. So the tone needs to be formal, there should be consistent use of standard English throughout. In terms of pronouns, writing to explain will tend to use third person and third person generic pronouns to establish some kind of distance, some space between the writer and the audience. Again, you will need to include some subject-specific vocabulary, but when you're using that in writing to explain, you will often also provide some kind of simplified explanation so that the reader understands what that vocabulary means, rather than filling the text full of lots of jargon that the ordinary person can't understand. Facts and statistics are important again, but remember, as with writing to inform, they must be believable, so don't make up outlandish, exaggerated things. And the sequential and causal connectives are key in writing that is designed to explain.